So hi everyone, my name is Patsy Novo. I'm with the Greater New York Node. I've been with the CTN since the very early days, and I've worn a lot of different hats during my time with the CTN. But today I'm going to be providing my perspective as the National Project Manager for CTN 51. Beth?
Hi everyone, my name is Beth Jeffries. I'm a protocol monitor at the Emmes Corporation. I've been monitoring for a little bit over 12 years. And prior to starting my career in monitoring, I actually worked as a study coordinator and a research assistant within the Clinical Trials Network. Patsy?
So the learning objectives for today are to describe drug management planning, discuss tools for drug accountability, and talk about implementation challenges and some QA considerations. And throughout the presentation, we'll be using CTN 51 as an example to illustrate drug accountability processes. So what is drug accountability? It's more than just counting pills. It should provide a complete accounting of drug handling from initial receipt through the final disposition, so that when you're done with the trial, you can link the effects seen in the study to the medication under investigation. And the FDA has listed drug accountability as number 3 in a list of the top 5 compliance pitfalls in clinical research. So it's important to pay attention to this. So although the sequence of steps may vary from one study to another, all of these folks have a role in the development, training, and implementation of the investigational product management and accountability for medication studies in the CTN. The CCTN is the sponsor. They provide guidance, approvals, and the resources for the study, including for the investigational product. The lead node generally develops the procedures and logs for tracking, often provides training in collaboration with CCC. The CCC also facilitates the drug manufacturing sometimes, definitely the supply, participating with some subcontract vendors and supplying this drug to the sites. DSC provides electronic data capture, sometimes randomization, and inventory management tools. And site staff provide local approvals, individual certifications, and licenses. They're trained on study-specific requirements, develop site-level SOPs, and then follow IP accountability procedures throughout the study from implementation through closeout. So here's an illustration of that, showing how the players interact in preparation for the IP management process in a study. You'll see all of the groups, so many activities, and the links between them. There's a lot to do. So it's important to put the needed time and effort up front in developing the appropriate procedures and tools to support drug accountability. Prep work will start as soon as the protocol has been approved by CCTN, with different players taking on a more active role depending on where we are in the study timeline. Sometimes responsibilities may overlap, such as between the CCC and the lead node, and those activities could be shared depending on the expertise of individuals on the team. And this was true for 51. So in our case, in this flow chart, you'll see a dashed line between the lead node and the CCC. This presentation will address considerations for developing the IP procedures and logs, accounting for IP throughout the study, quality assurance, and closeout and reconciliation planning. And now Beth will talk about the GCP and the CCC's role.
Before we talk specifically about the CCC's role, let's discuss good clinical practice standards and regulations of IP management. GCP lists IP guidelines in the list of essential documents, ICHE 6, Section 8. It provides instructions for shipping and handling of IP and the associated documentation expectations. There are also federal regulations noted in 21 CFR 312.62 that state investigators are required to maintain adequate records of IP disposition, as well as maintain adequate case histories for all study participants. Federal regulations require IP records to be retained for either 2 years after the approval of the marketing application or 2 years after the study has ended. The requirement for the clinical trials network are a little longer, where IP records are expected to be retained for 3 years after study closure. In terms of the CCC's role in IP management, we will identify the vendors for the manufacturing and supplying of study drugs. We will negotiate costs and funding which includes how the drug will be prepared and packaged for the study. For example, if the study needs coated tablets, blister packs, or study kits. The CCC often coordinates with a central pharmacy to have the drug appropriately stored where it will be ready for shipment to the sites. The CCC can arrange for IP analytical testing and reporting as needed, and will also collect required documents from the site staff for study drug to be received, returned, replaced, or destroyed. The sites must provide the CCC with their IRB approval letter prior to shipment of IP to the sites. For controlled drugs such as buprenorphine, the site physician or clinician must provide the DEA registration for receipt of drug in order for the central pharmacy to ship IP to the site address. The CCC provides reports to regulatory authorities, which may include the drug logs managed by the sites. When reporting to the FDA for IND studies, the submission may include a copy of the protocol, any IP-related documentation, analytical testing certifications, as well as annual reports. When reporting to RAPC for studies with research sites in California, the submission often includes a copy of the drug logs. The CCC also provides additional reports to IP suppliers as needed. For example, Alkermes requires drug logs to be submitted for studies in which it supplies Vivitrol. Keep in mind that reporting requirements will vary depending on whether the drug was purchased or donated from one supplier to the next. The CCC has experienced many IP management challenges that we have learned to overcome. One of our challenges is shipping to sites across the U.S. or other regions and making sure that the drug is received appropriately. When determining a point to manufacture and supply the drug, we have to consider the shelf life and expiration date of the medication. We also have to consider when sites will be ready for study implementation. We don't want to prepare or ship study drug too soon or too late so that we can avoid wasting drug and also wasting money on the associated costs. We also want to ensure that an adequate amount of IP is maintained on the site at the site at all times. We want to avoid supply hoarding or last-minute requests that occur with manual reordering process. This is also challenging as enrollment rates can significantly fluctuate at any point in time across sites. So one strategy for addressing one of the IP management challenges is the development of a centralized medication and supply tracking system. Inventory can be tracked using programmable reports in the Advantage EDC or Advantage clinical systems. To facilitate the process of replacing study drug, the site staff will enter the inventory levels on hand at the site and the medication expiration date into the system. This information is expected to be submitted on the last day of the week. The information is then populated into an inventory report the next day following the data entry. If the inventory was not submitted, a reminder email is sent to the site staff. Supplies that are at or below the threshold are then populated into a reorder spreadsheet. The CCC administrative coordinators would then process the orders and submit the request to the vendors. Resupply thresholds are sometimes adjusted periodically based on the rate of enrollments at the sites. The DSC can also develop more advanced features for drug utility within the electronic randomization system if needed. For example, if a study has blinded medication, the system could be customized and set up to send the drug supplier an email notification containing a list of drug kits that need to be shipped to the sites. Another IP management challenge is ensuring that medication is appropriately received by the site staff. Once the central pharmacy, such as Emmes, process orders received, they will send the site staff an email indicating that the study drug has been shipped and is en route. Once the medication has been received, the site staff will immediately inspect the package contents and confirm that the items were received in a usable condition. The site staff will then fill out the shipping acknowledgement form and return it to Eminent via fax. Some studies may require local procurement of certain medications. For logistic purposes, medications that are not study drugs will not be obtained through the CCC. In these cases, the staff will be responsible for directly ordering and obtaining the medication. One example is naloxone, which was used for the naloxone challenge in CTN 0051 and CTN 0055 protocols. I will now turn it over to Patsy to discuss developing and maintaining IP accountability logs.
Thanks, Beth. So for purposes of the call, I just want to remind people that CTN 51 is an open label effectiveness study looking at Vivitrol versus Suboxone in the treatment of opioid dependence. So one of the lead node's responsibilities in CTN 51 was to develop the tools for tracking study medication at the participating sites. This included creating inventory logs, defining storage requirements, and creating temperature logs, thinking through how to track dispensing to participants, and developing any other documentation or process that might be needed in the management of study drugs at the participating sites. So like I said, CTN 51 is an open label study, and it had 3 different medications, naloxone, Suboxone, and Vivitrol. Each had different procurement and different storage requirements. So we started with the inventory logs, and this is a way to make sure that you have adequate supplies on hand of each study medication. Vivitrol and Suboxone were shipped to the sites from Eminent, which is the Emmes Central Pharmacy, but sites had to supply the naloxone for the naloxone challenge themselves. These logs also need to track when drugs are removed from inventory, so when they're prescribed or administered to participants, or expired, returned, or wasted, in order to have a running tally of how much you have on hand at any point and when to reorder. And this links into the EDC inventory system, but the logs are the source document for a lot of this information. So this is an example of the log we created for naloxone, which was, as I said, procured locally. There's a section for the drugs received into inventory, then a section for drugs removed, the disposition or what happened, whether it was administered to a participant or wasted or returned, and then a place for the running balance. Here's the same log for the Vivitrol, which came in kits. So you have drug in, drug out, what happened, and a running balance. In this log, we also included a brief handling note at the bottom for what to do with the kit if a participant was a no-show to the medication appointment, or if the Vivitrol could not be administered as planned, say if the participant failed the challenge and would be reinduced, or you would try to reinduce that participant later on. Similar log for Suboxone, we provided both 4 milligram and 8 milligram films. So this is the 4 milligram one. And we did it on separate logs, mostly for space reasons. You also have to think about how tiny the writing might need to get in order to use these on an ongoing basis. And again, at the bottom, a note about when Suboxone could be returned to inventory, but for the most part, it was treated as waste. And finally, because Suboxone is a controlled substance, we developed a waste log and a separate set of procedures to be able to track the Suboxone returned by participants. We wanted to make sure that it would be kept separate from the available dispensing inventory and to provide documentation for reconciliation by the CCC monitors and eventual return to Eminent. As I mentioned earlier, all 3 medications had different storage requirements. The naloxone simply had to be maintained within a temperature range, but the Vivitrol requires refrigeration, and the Suboxone requires more secure storage as it's Schedule III medication. It was important that study drug be secured separately from the regular drug supply of the site so that it wouldn't be inadvertently used for non-study participants or patients. All locations needed temperature monitoring. Drug storage was a consideration during site selection, at site initiation, and during the conduct of the study. It also is something to think about in inventory management, since some sites may not have a lot of room to be able to keep a large supply of study drugs sequestered. In CTN 51, we asked sites to develop local SOPs for how dispensing and accountability would occur. Some sites used their pharmacies and pharmacists, and some used nursing or other clinical staff to manage the drug for the study. Participant medication logs were developed to track the administration of study drug to participants, including the date, amount, dose, lot number, and so on. And these provide the source document for medication administration. With these logs, it was important to consider not only how we expected administration to occur per protocol, but also to think about how to document excursions, both those that were allowed, since the study provided some flexibility in dosing, but also ones that might be protocol deviations. So patients receiving Vivitrol often receive naloxone beforehand in what's called a naloxone challenge to make sure that they're sufficiently cleared of opiates. Otherwise, administering Vivitrol can put them into precipitated withdrawal and the participants can feel quite sick. So for participants on the Vivitrol arm, we combined the naloxone and the Vivitrol on one log and provided some brief guidance at the bottom. In the normal course of things, a participant would have one naloxone challenge and then 6 monthly Vivitrol injections. However, it was possible for participants to be challenged more than once before being successfully inducted onto Vivitrol. So we thought that more lines might be needed. Also, the study allowed participants to reinitiate Vivitrol, provided they didn't meet study criteria for relapse. So a later naloxone challenge might also be required. And then participants were expected to have 6 injections, but the protocol allowed for as many as 7. So we provided a shaded line at the bottom for a 7th shot. Participants on the Suboxone arm received weekly doses at the beginning, then every 2 weeks, and finally every 4 weeks to eventually mirror the dosing schedule of the participants on the Vivitrol arm. As in the prior log, we created shaded lines for the weeks when dispensing was not expected, but was allowed per clinical judgment. This is an easy visual way to make sure that you're recording on the correct line. We didn't put up the page 2 of this log, but we created space for dose adjustments and allowed for replacement doses at the discretion of the study physician. So there's a lot of documentation surrounding IP in a clinical trial. The documentation should be simple and useful, but also sufficient to properly track and reconcile study IP. And those two principles can sometimes feel at odds. And we struggled a little bit with this in CTN 51, feeling like there was a lot of paper and documentation, and keeping it simple was a little bit of a challenge for us. So you've seen a lot of the copies of the logs, but the records also included the shipping receipts to and from Eminent, prescriptions, signature logs for who was allowed to handle the drug, and so on. We provided training both at the start of the study and ongoing as folks got started using the logs and had a few more questions. And it can be useful to keep all of this documentation in one place, and we recommended a specific binder or sometimes binders for the use of sites in CTN 51. And these records are all reviewed by local and CCC monitors when they complete QA visits, and then as a whole, these form the basis for drug accountability in the study. So some of the challenges that we found in CTN 51 were mostly around implementing research infrastructure in a clinical setting. This is an open label study, and often the sites are using one or more of the medications in the regular course of treatment of their patients. We found we needed to be vigilant and often take extra precautions to keep the inventory separate. The documentation process for the study didn't necessarily match what sites were doing clinically. For example, some sites used standing orders and not individual prescriptions for dispensing medication. Sites developed local SOPs for the management of drug inventories and dispensing, but sometimes they weren't followed or conflicted with the prevailing culture of the clinic. It's also important to review these from time to time as you move through the study, not just at the beginning. And sometimes what you thought would work doesn't work in practice or may need to change if some other changes occur in how a site conducts its non-research business. As you're developing these for your study or your site, make sure you test them and run them by the clinical staff. We trained at the start and we taped the training so that subsequent staff could be trained later on down the line. But this has been a long study, and there's been turnover in both the research and the clinical teams. These issues were not severe, and they were dealt with on a case-by-case basis with retraining, refining of SOPs, or other kinds of corrective action plans. And now Beth will talk a little more about the quality assurance process in IP accountability.
Thank you, Patsy. So based on GCP guidelines, the site monitors are expected to review the investigational product on hand and the shipping records before the study begins, and also ensure that drug accountability procedures are adequate for study implementation. During the course of the trial, the study monitors will review all IP documentation to ensure that the drug has been used according to the protocol. And once the trial has been completed, site monitors will conduct a final review of IP accountability, and this includes all drug received by the site, all drug dispensed, returned, and destroyed. In preparation for site monitoring visits, the site staff should ensure that all IP records are accurate and reconcile with study drug on hand. The site staff should also ensure that storage monitoring logs are kept current and any excursions are appropriately documented. Site staff can consult the MOB or other documents for more detailed guidance on IP procedures. During a site visit, the CCC monitor will assist the site staff with returning study drug to the central pharmacy as needed. As part of the procedures, the site staff and the CCC monitor will complete an agent return form as part of the drug return documentation. The CCC will typically send the site staff guidance for medication return. This slide displays a copy of the instructions that were provided for the CTN 0051 protocol. The document indicates the specific medication and notes the expected procedures for returning the drug. The next slide displays a copy of the agent return form, which is sent with the package of return medication. The form documents the content of IP being returned to the central pharmacy, and the form is also completed and signed by both the site staff and the CCC monitor. Upon closeout of a trial, the site staff is to ensure that outstanding issues and action items related to IP records are addressed in a timely fashion. The site staff should also prepare IP logs for long-term storage and be prepared to answer any questions that the CCC may have regarding the reconciliation of medication. It's important for site staff to know what is expected after a closeout visit. The site staff will provide final drug logs to the CCC for final reporting to the regulatory authorities and suppliers as required. The CCC will conduct an overall reconciliation of medication distributed, received, dispensed, lost, and destroyed. At the end of the study, the disposition of remaining IP will either be returned to the central pharmacy for destruction, or the site may donate the remaining IP per their local and institutional policies. There are many challenges in monitoring drug accountability. Long visit intervals, whether it's based on study design or just missed study visits, can lead to participants missing doses or misplacing study drugs. Many times these events are not appropriately documented. Incomplete logs or missing information on the logs can lead to unaccounted medication and also make drug conciliation impossible. Also, study drug that is not documented on the logs because information was not appropriately transferred, such as new drug shipments, returned or wasted medication, can also lead to unaccounted study drug. Next, let's discuss the takeaway message. Drug management and accountability is required based on GCP guidelines and other regulatory standards. Everyone is involved, from the sponsor to the lead node, CCC, DSC, and the research staff. Drug management has a lot of moving parts and can be complex. Plan for drug accountability early in the development phase of the study. Effort up front may save a lot of time in the end. And don't remake the wheel. There are tools out there that can be used when creating drug logs for your study. The next slide provides a list of references. I will now turn it over to Tracy to open the lines up for any questions or comments.
I did have a question. So, Beth, when you come across any of the challenges with the sites, what can happen on a monitoring visit when you find something?
It really depends on the issue that was identified, but it may require the sites to make edits to documentation or create other documentation noting any excursions or anything that wasn't appropriately documented.
What would be a good example of an excursion?
Anything that was documented as it wasn't expected.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. So, for example, if there was an excursion with, let's say over the weekend, they lost power at the site, then they would actually have to create documentation, because the drug logs, the medication had gone below the reference ranges and so forth, something like that?
Correct.
Okay, good. And if there was no documentation, they would in fact just be encouraged to, or it would become an action item in the site visit report. Right.
That is also correct.
Okay, good. Did anyone else have any questions?
Yeah, I have a question. What sort of protocol deviations or violations come up regarding drugs, handling of medications?
Thanks, Tim. Typically if there's missing information, what other if product isn't stored as expected, as mentioned in the presentation, Vivitrol is expected to be refrigerated and kept at a temperature between 2 and 8 degrees Celsius. Does that answer your question?
Yes, one question I have is what would be, if you can give an example of what is the difference between a protocol deviation versus a protocol violation regarding medications, IPs?
So this is Patsy. I'm not sure. I think it may just be semantic in terms of deviation or violation.
Okay.
I think I don't know that one is necessarily more severe than the other. I think it just means that something happened that was contrary to what the protocol says should have happened. And you might have, some might be defined as major deviations. So it's significant and it may affect data or it may affect safety, versus minor in that it deviates from the protocol, but it's not going to impact either safety or the data itself.
So to that point, for Tim, isn't there a requirement in the study to administer medication at particular doses and so forth? So if a dose was inappropriately administered, would that be a protocol violation?
Yes. The CTN 51 in particular has a great deal of flexibility because its effectiveness, and we really wanted to see what was happening in the real world and allowed a lot of clinical judgment. So the dose of Suboxone, for example, that participants can receive is up to the study physician at the site. There's a range that we provide in the protocol, but the study clinicians can make those decisions. So deviations for dose in this study weren't necessarily common, but in other kinds of medication trials, that matters a lot. You want to make sure that if you're testing a particular dose of a study, that participants get that dose. So if they get twice as much or half as much, you want to make sure that your records can record that so that the down the road implications of the study results aren't called into question.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, I think we've covered this topic. If you did have any additional questions, please feel free to reach out to us at ctntraining@ms.com, and we could get those questions over to Beth and Patsy and others who can help us to sort through, your development of your logs and also maintaining them through study implementation. So Patsy and Beth, thank you for covering this material so well.
My pleasure.
Thank you, everyone.
So I will edit this presentation and send it to the CTN Dissemination Library to post to our archive, and that way you'll have it as a resource later on. So we invite everyone back next month where we will have a guest speaker who will present Perceptions of Harm and Addiction of Snus. And that will occur on November 30th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. So please come back next month and we will have a new topic. I will actually send out an invitation for you to register soon. So please look out for that. And that will end our presentation today. Thank you everyone for coming. See you next month.